Okay. Good evening, everyone, and I thank the organizers for the opportunity to participate in the joint course, and I apologize for having to change the order of the presentations and having to have Marta as secretary, and thank you. Today, I'm talking about defining and redefining lithics in prehistory from archaeological specimens to museum objects. It is an important part of my PhD work that I am doing with the University of Ferrara in the National Museum of Natural History in Paris. So it is basically on lithics in the museum and the many dimensions that these two elements entail. And it aims, for one, to discuss the application of an experimental museology approach to some aspects of prehistoric research with the valorization of lithics and archaeology in the public sphere as its finality. So why the museum? The museum is an interesting place because they embody our intrinsic relationship with objects and the act of collecting. Humans are deeply material beings. Our history, identity, and memory are often tied to the tangible. If not ourselves, you may know somebody who collects things at home or in their office. And especially today, perhaps in every city, there is at least one museum. And while we have quote unquote formal definitions of the museum from the ecom or whatever, no one can really stop us from making a museum of anything. This to say that for humans, objects are more than just tools or possessions, and they are vessels of meaning, markers of identity, and links between the past and the present. Before continuing, I'd like to define some terms that may be useful for the presentation moving forward. Doing this research, I understand that there are many different trends in the discipline that depending on the tradition. Even just focusing in France, in Italy, and Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and in the Anglo-American community, and with that of the rest of the world, for me, still to explore. So for the purposes of this work, we stick to the following general definitions. Museology as a study of museums and their role in society, as a definition by the International Committee for Museology. And over the past centuries, this has evolved significantly, transitioning from practical guidelines for museum organization to an academic discipline concerned with the theory, philosophy, and social implications of museums. It is not to be confused with museography, which is the practical aspect or a set of techniques associated with museum practices. Some people also call museology the science of museums, but within the Anglo-American community, this is still pretty much discussed, and so they prefer the term museum studies. Next slide, please. So, of course, why lithics? We acknowledge that the archaeological record is much more than just lithics, and many scholars are against this sort of lithic-centric approach, and we know that any sort of blindness into micro view of anything is dangerous. At least with ever developing technologies, we are able to recover more archaeological remains and in better ways. But for now, we cannot deny that the ubiquity of stone artifacts make them an excellent subject for many kinds of studies. More importantly, and which is something I'd like to highlight as well, is that lithics are multidimensional objects in that they embody multiple meanings and transformations depending on a combination of factors in time, space, and the disciplines within which they are being treated. Other than this, you may also say that in general, cultural representations of prehistoric archaeology as heritage are underrated in the general consciousness. We'd like to highlight heritage as related to human origins and deep history. Next slide, please. So I suppose we can all appreciate the presence and prevalence of lithics in the archaeological record, as mentioned before, but because of its good preservation properties or as a reflection of its role in antiquity. But it is also the first proof of human occupation of a site, especially in the absence of human remains. And other than that, can help our chronology and the rest of the knowledge that we are able to obtain from different methodologies and approaches to the study of lithic artifacts, especially when consolidated with those of the rest of the archaeological assemblage. In short, it is crucial to the reconstruction of ancient life phase for the past and very important for us in the present to understand this. Next slide, please. So what do we mean when we say the archaeological record and lithics as specimen in an articulate way? So the excavation and recovery of lithic artifacts recontextualize them from once buried finds to specimens that embody specific research potential to be treated as empirical data points depending on the archaeologists who engage in the deliberate process to evaluate the artifacts and who select one or a combination of different frameworks: positivist, interpretivist, post-processual, phenomenological, to be applied in their study, informed by research questions and analytical techniques that best align with the artifact's attributes, the archaeological context, and of course their objectives of their research. This transformation underpins a systematic evidence-based approach, specifically aimed at revealing the process of the scientific method. And here I list just some of the analysis that we know very commonly, but this is not an exhaustive list, of course. And just to bear in mind that these approaches also evolve through the history of science and the development of archaeology as a discipline. So we know that from before, many disciplines would dominate the research field, and then this would change depending on not only archaeology as well, but the change of paradigms in social sciences in general, and history of science and technology in a general way, also across the world. Next slide. Thank you. So before going anywhere, we recognize the gap that there is a sort of disconnect between this is a premise. So of course, this is what the research is based on. There is a disconnect between the archaeological record and the laboratories, the archaeological record and the laboratories of archaeologists and the public sphere, where non-specialists are able to access some objects we excavated and analyzed. With this in mind, the idea is to focus on concepts in technology and technique and material culture. We hold this thought. Next slide, please. So, of course, it is worth to immediately specify that when we speak of museum, we talk about the different contexts in which we are able to see prehistory collections or lithic collections. Just for this study, these are some of the museums. Now the list is even longer, but just for this presentation, going around, we know that lithic collections are presented to the public in various ways and with varying emphasis depending on the curation, mission, vision, and even history of the museum in which they are situated. Next slide, please. So generally, in a prehistoric museum, lithics are presented within the context of human evolution, the production and use of stone tools for hunting and survival, and how stone tool technology evolves through time. There is a clear emphasis on lithic artifacts and as an important material to define chronology in terms of richness and diversity of the industries. And it is also quite common for these museums to provide exhibits on the archaeological excavation process and introduce what the archaeologist does. Meanwhile, in archaeological museums, lithics are often organized together with other artifacts to define cultures, to create a narrative and connections and differences among the human groups to which these materials belong. And chronology is presented as artifact packages that represent a way of life that change depending on the period. They tend to operate, moreover, on a more regional scale, concentrating displays and artifacts recovered from the archaeological sites in the zone that the museum represents. Among natural history museums, the role of lithics may be significant or modest. It depends on the museum's project or the nature of the discoveries. Key exhibits are often centered on the fossils of the different human species as well as of hominid relatives to explain the evolution of physical and, with the stone artifacts, behavioral traits. Napstone artifacts are also found in geological museums sometimes, although playing a relatively minor supporting role compared with other types of museums, included to mark the presence of early and modern humans in the geological time scale or to demonstrate the kind of raw materials that humans preferred to nap from a geological context. I also add a specific role of local or site museums in these, as in these museums, lithics tend to have an even stronger presence considering that many of them are established specifically to house and exhibit original artifacts recovered from the local archaeological sites and collections, which frequently consist primarily of lithics. So it is worth noting that many of these prehistoric archaeological museums are site museums in that they are found in the vicinity of the archaeological sites and therefore have a very critical role in terms of heritage conservation and protection through allowing, among other things, direct engagement between the public and the materials and the sites. The position of prehistoric artifacts is unique in the sense that while part of the collections in general, they don't necessarily suffer the same problems as, say, ethnographic collections, but neither of natural history or science collections. It is quite consistent with the same dynamics of archaeology, really blurring the dichotomy between science, between the sciences and the humanities. Of course, the trends that I have mentioned before really depends are general in that they really depend on a case to case basis because as we know there are combination museums that would be a natural history and archaeological museum, for example, but more or less these are the common observations. So the proposal here is to take from prehistoric sciences, going back to the transition slide that we held the thought of from before. The proposal here is to take from prehistoric sciences methodology integrated with anthropological and philosophical perspectives and theories, to not mention all, in filling this gap that we recognized from before. In other words, creating a process of transition, transformation, redefinition in which these objects, if not retain, can create new meanings that can resonate with the public. So there are several other theoretical frameworks in social sciences that address how objects meaning shift depending on context, use, and social factors. But we would like to focus on a combination, especially of technological and material culture approaches, often considered as separate, if not contrary methodologies. In this work, we maintain that with the right settings and applications, this combination make an effective framework for an experimental museology project with this objective in mind. You may all be already very familiar with the concepts of technological approach and chain operatoire, and I realize that it is very widely applied in many different disciplines other than prehistoric research. Perspective here is that in the museum, the chain operatoire approach, as it is employed in the technological lithic analysis, can be used in as a narrative tool in a museum display to visually highlight the sequential operations by which natural resources were transformed into objects that are culturally meaningful and functional and respond to a need of the past human populations. This is a huge Inuit-san citation. Along with necessity and intentionality, it can be integrated here other implied considerations prerequisite to or surrounding the sequence itself, such as basic choices or even constraints that can impact the chain operatoire. So instead of seeing just the finished product, visitors can be provided the opportunity in the museum to engage in a process-oriented interpretation and discover for themselves the knowledge, problem-solving, decision-making, and technical complexity and craftsmanship that go into stone tool production. From an inter-transdisciplinary perspective, an extended chain operatoire is already recognized in heritage studies and museology, described to be directed towards the later stages of the life of archaeological materials, leading them into a whole new sphere. This sphere being the public sphere that is the museum. That on one hand, and this is all well and good if we have the archaeological provenance of our lithic collection. However, we all know that in reality, this is not always the case, and there are physical limitations when museums deal with collections that for some reason are no longer accompanied by their documentation. Even now, in our archaeological work, we encounter sites that have been previously excavated, and especially small museums with these collections without archaeological information. But actually, these artifacts remain protected by the law as assets and are therefore required by regulations to be cataloged, studied, and valorized. And so the question here is how can we address these problems? And the answer is that we need to find alternative ways of reading and analyzing lithic collections. So on one hand, we have the technological approach, and on the other, we have material culture studies. For one, whose core idea, material culture studies, for one, whose core idea is that these objects carry meanings that are socially constructed and change based on their context and the relationships people form with them. One of the more known works would be The Social Life of Things by anthropologist Arjuna Padurai, which focuses on the biography of objects and how their meaning transforms as they move through different contexts. So production, exchange, use, and display. And this is an ongoing work, and so these frameworks are only the juice at the moment, but there are other frameworks that offer potential for museographic applications, such as actors network theory. This one is a sociological one. Also from museum and heritage studies that talk more about museums and their role in curating, interpreting, and displaying objects, which then acquire new meanings. And the phenomenology as well, talking about objects not being passive items, but that are experienced and understood through human interaction, experience, and perception. The point that we are trying to establish is that, and underline here, is that treating lithics as archaeological specimens, there we cite lithic studies as basic science, um, and subjecting them to analysis is fundamental and cannot be missed as for it to have an effective communication dimension as a museum object, and that this process is not necessarily a transformation but an expansion, in some cases a reconfiguration, and can be applied to different states of lithic collection. So as we were saying before, if we are faced with a lithic collection that doesn't necessarily have its archaeological provenance, we can use another approach to study these collections so that we don't just have to keep them in the storage of a museum. So this is an approach that salvages the value of lithic artifacts without complete archaeological context. Um, and so we have an approach of experimental museology that aims to valorize lithic collections in the best, most productive way possible, and that takes as well from an interdisciplinary approach, because we are talking about a field in which it is imperative to have the opinions and expertise not only of museum managers who already have the lithic collections with them, but also of prehistorians, archaeologists, and other social scientists in this way, all towards the objective to be able to communicate the importance of these objects to the wider public. For all the objects it may house or purposes it may serve, the museum is uniquely positioned at the intersection of art, science, history, and society. And so the major interest for us is this is where opportunities are created for the public to engage directly with archaeologists and with archaeological materials recovered from excavation by archaeologists, including stone tools and other lithic artifacts. For non-specialists, this is the best place to directly engage with the complexities of human prehistory through authentic objects and the narratives they embody. And so to finish, also just to say that this has been a very lithics focused work, but it can also be seen that also Shena Peratwa is used to study other technological materials in archaeology and not only in prehistory. It can be used in other materials in the museum as well. That's all. Thank you.